Hello, all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this podcast. And thank you for joining me here on the Goddess Project podcast. My name is Dr. Carla Ionescu, and today we're going to be talking about the Holy Grail. Sorry, this microphone is acting weird. Today we're going to talk about the Holy Grail, and I'm super, super excited. Now, this is normally something that I talk about on the side of other things. So usually when I'm doing, let's say, a lecture on Christianity or a lecture on symbolism in Christianity, and sometimes actually in one of my courses I also do a lecture on Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary. So this is in theory a little bit different than perhaps some of the other conversations that we've had about goddesses. But the very fascinating aspect of this is that this connects to goddesses and, in fact, connects to everything we've talked about this season in its usual fantastic way, right? So, you know how I always tell you guys, like, I start something and I'm like, this looks interesting, or something comes up and I'm like, I'll look this up. And then I start digging and I start looking at things and I'm like, no, I have to talk about this. I have to share some of the information I've come across. And so the Holy Grail is really fascinating in that way as well. And my favorite part, I think, about doing objects or symbols, like, we've done caves and we've done triangles and we've done all that stuff. My favorite part about that is the way that it is applicable in our modern day society. My favorite part about it is the way that the archaic, ancient, the sort of primordial continues to connect to us today, or we continue to connect to it without even noticing. And I really, really like that's really the part that I feel truly passionate about. And of course, the goddess is fundamental in all of those things. But the connections and the way that it's applicable and the ways that perhaps we don't think about the way that it's applicable is my favorite part in discovery. And so if you're new to the podcast or you've never listened to me before, hello. I want to say that this podcast is unedited. I don't know if I said that before. It's totally unedited. Every now and then I will pause my recording to either review my notes or see what's coming next or whatever, or grab a drink if we're going on for a bit. But it's totally unedited because honestly, I'm unedited. I always wanted to be, so my mentor in academia, Professor Barry Wilson, was a professor that really embodied the way that I like to learn. And I like to learn in a way that is informal or appears to be informal and comfortable. And when the academic setting is more egalitarian. So that means that I recognize that you know more or you're an expert in the field, but you don't treat me like a child or a teenager or like high schooly. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but I like to learn in an informal setting, more with respect and conversation and discussion, rather than sort of a being lectured at, although, there's time for that as well. And so, long way of saying this is why I like this to be informal, because, and I think sometimes that costs me a bit, because I think sometimes the fact that I'm informal in many ways, the fact that I'm kind of having fun and kind of ranty and I go off with, sometimes people, how do I say this nicely? I don't know. Sometimes people think I don't know all the things I know, or I feel like people feel like they're on par, that their opinion and my knowledge are on par. And so sometimes that costs me a bit. I know that there are very strict, old-fashioned professors that their automatic demeanor and their formality gains them a kind of hush respect, in the sense that students don't question, students don't ask, students are like, yes, for sure, you're an expert. That also happens if they're white males. But for me, sometimes because I'm having fun with this thing. And I want us to have discussions. For me, sometimes the opposite happens where it can get a little bit people push the boundaries of professionalism. So informal professional, I think, is a great way of doing it. For this podcast, of course, because this podcast is totally outside the academe, but I am an academic. And so that's not something you can take away from someone. I had a little back and forth today, sorry for the side story, with a woman in one of the Facebook groups. I posted something and I posted a sculpture of Artemis, and her reply was, "Oh no, this is Diana. She came before her name Diana came before the Greeks, and she was Roman, and blah blah blah." And she just went on this kind of thing. And I replied, giving her just a short, brief history of the fact that at least we should agree that the Greeks came before the Romans. But no, she was like, "No, that's wrong. All these people that think they know stuff, they don't know." And I'm a little fascinated by that. The fact that sorry, I'm trying to be nice. The fact that, 10 years of study and reading and translation, this individual thinks, equals their whatever time might be they spend on the internet or whatever knowledge they've come across. Sometimes to me, it's a bit mind-boggling. And while I'm totally into questioning authority and questioning knowledge and questioning facts or truth, because that's part of learning, there has to be some form of balance there. There has to be some type of respect, I guess, in a way, for the quantity of work you have to do to get to a certain point. Yeah. Especially in academia, to the highest point, in the case of a PhD of knowledge. And so that's not saying that you're absolutely 100% right, or there's no room for discussion or questioning. But I just think that there are some things that that you're an expert in, and that's all there is to it. And so, and that's fine. Sorry, I don't mean to rant at you guys. I'm not ranting at you guys, but I just, I had this conversation this morning, and I think it's still in my head because I just couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that you think the Romans came before the Greeks and they named her Diana out of a complete mistranslation of both Greek and Latin that she sent me. Anyways, I take Artemis things a bit personally. Sorry. I'm pretty angry at academics, I think, for ignoring her and for misrepresenting her and for all those things. And so sometimes when people come at me with things that are just mind-bogglingly wrong, I sometimes get a little, it stays with me for a bit, but I will let it go now. Thank you for listening to my short rant. But I'm sorry if you're new and this is your first time ever listening to me. I apologize for coming out of the gate full force. But if you are new, welcome. And I hope that you enjoy, like I said, this very informal discussion about this week, the Holy Grail. This is episode 118. So we have one more episode next week, and then we have our finale question and answer episode, which is really awesome. I'm very much looking forward to it. So next week we're going to do sirens and mermaids, because I want to talk about that, and I keep coming across sirens everywhere, and so it's like that's a sign. So our 19th episode will be on sirens and mermaids, and then we'll have the question and answer. So I'm collecting lots of questions from people on social media, or they're just DMing me questions that they want to ask about literally anything, really. And I'm going to film my answers and discussions to those questions. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. That will be in 2 weeks from now. And then school is starting, so we'll take a little break. That'll be the season finale. The university is starting after Labor Day. And so it'll be a bit chaotic for a bit, and then we'll start with season 2 later on in the fall. Yeah. And if you've been with me for a while, thank you so much. For those of you that listen to this podcast religiously, I just want to say how much I appreciate you. You know who you are. We talk on Twitter. We talk on Instagram. We talk in the YouTube comments every now and then, and on the Goddess We Talk everywhere. I just want to say thank you to you, because when I started this podcast in March, I wasn't sure what I was doing. I still am not, but wasn't sure what I was doing. Wasn't sure if people were interested. Wasn't sure if people would enjoy my style of just like talking about things and connecting things in different ways. And so I really just want to say thank you. For those of you who support me on Patreon, we're going to do after the podcast, we're going to talk about Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. For those of you who support me on Patreon, I just want to shout out a special thank you, because your continued support allows me to continue doing this research and continue doing this podcast and the books that I'm writing and all those kinds of things. It helps me take some time away from teaching and focus on research. So thank you so much. So just those are, thank you so much to everyone. And of course, thank you to everyone listening and watching this. Yeah. All right. So let's get to the Holy Grail. I'm going to pull up, if you're listening to me, I'm just going to pull up my slides. If you're watching, give me 1 second and I'm going to pull these up. So we're going to do a little bit of a circular. Is the right one? Yes. Yes, it is. A circular sort of presentation. I call this episode "The Blood is the Life" because, first of all, I love that. That's a very vampiric Hollywood thing to say. The blood is the life, right? And in fact, I really wanted to connect the Holy Grail to vampires. Maybe I will at the end a little bit, or maybe in the after the podcast we'll talk about it, because we're talking about the Grail in Hollywood. But because the Grail has so much eternal life, blood connotations, drinking blood, those kinds of things, this phrase just kept echoing over and over, right? The blood is the life. Yeah. And that's a very vampiric thing. And because, I, as a Romanian, I come from a country where vampires are said to have been born. And so every time we talk about blood drinking or blood letting or blood anything, and even impaling, if we're talking about Vlad the Impaler, I can't help but think vampire, right? And so The Blood is the Life is the title of this, the Holy Grail, Myths and Symbols. And we're going to begin with something very, very simple that reconnects us to past episodes. And we're going to talk about the pubic triangle. So here, if you're not watching this, on the screen, I have an image of the cup, the sort of Holy Grail cup with a, I don't know what that is, a piece of cloth over it, folding over almost like long years. Yeah. And then, of course, a picture of the female reproductive system, the uterus with the fallopian tubes, ovaries, and cervix and vagina, whatever. And the reason why I pulled this image up, and you could Google these images anywhere, and actually I think I posted this image on my Instagram, is because the cup itself, the very first association, okay, before we get into the legends, the very first association between the cup that's filled with the blood of Christ that gives life, the very first and basic association is that the female uterus, or the whole reproductive system, but the female uterus with the blood of the divine feminine, I'm going to go with, okay, that gives life, is literally the symbol that the cup or the Holy Grail represents. But the issue that I'm going to have in this episode is the very fact that once again, we have an attempt by patriarchy to literally remove the power of the uterus and the reproductive blood, put it into an object that is often depicted in a fantastically gold or expensive form, and then use it by men, for men, to create and give life, and to create and give salvation, and to create and give a kind of rebirth. Yeah. So again, the conquering, the taking of the divine feminine symbols in this one of reproduction and life-giving becomes the property of patriarchy. Yeah. And so the very first thing I think that we need to make clear is, of course, the use of pubic triangles. Now, in my episode on the caves, I did talk a lot about pubic triangles and how the pubic triangle is literally an inverted triangle, and how this was the original triangle before even the pyramids, and before before those triangles were actually inverted. Actually, my very language around that is wrong, because the pyramids themselves, so the triangle facing up, should be called the inverted triangle, because the original triangle is upside down. Yeah. But I guess in the English language, or in any language, that's the upside down triangle has become secondary, when it was primary. And so the cup itself, even if you just think of a cup as sort of a V, right, or a U, the cup itself can be seen as an inverted triangle. Or in the case of my argument, a pubic triangle. And the fact that this cup holds blood that you drink, and that gives you salvation or eternal life, or life, is literally the uterus. I don't know if that could be, made any clearer. Now, the Holy Grail itself, okay, so the supposed cup, the Holy Grail is traditionally thought to be the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, we're going to talk about in a minute, and that Joseph of Arimathea used to collect Jesus's blood at his crucifixion. So from ancient legends all the way to, like I said, Indiana Jones, which we're going to talk about in a minute, this cup has been a symbol of fascination and mystery for men. Actually, no, okay, sorry. Now that I'm thinking about it, it is fascination for men. Now, last night, if you follow me on Instagram, I posted a little clip from Indiana Jones where the rich dude, whose name I can't remember, comes to Indy and says, you want to look for this cup. We've almost found this cup. And Indy's like, oh, it's a bedtime story, blah, blah, blah. And then the guy says, this is the dream of men, the goal of men. Every man wants this cup. And I posted that on purpose because I thought to myself, yes, because when you live in a body that literally is a holy grail, that is a reproductive cup with blood of birth, you don't need to drink from a cup. Okay. Although we'll talk about why women drink from the cup anyways, especially within Christianity, not especially, but within Christianity. And so and I'm speaking about those who live in women's biological bodies, or female biological bodies, we don't need a cup to drink to procreate. We just do that naturally, right? So when I say that this has been an object of fascination for centuries, I mean for men. Yeah. Lots and lots of people have hunted and sought after this Christian relic. And we're going to look at two main stories other than the Last Supper, and that is the Knights Templar and Arthurian legend. Yeah. Now, the actual word itself, grail, some people say probably comes from the Latin word gadale, which refers to like a deep platter or a deep bowl where foods are served in. And especially during the medieval banquets, they would have these deep bowls or deep chalices. Yeah. It could be anything. It's been described often as a dish or a chalice or platter or goblet, anything, right? Sometimes it's even described as a stone, which is a bit interesting. And this grail has been said to have miraculous healing powers. Okay. Now, some historians argue that this kind of idea has been traced back to pre-Christian Celtic mythology. I agree. I think it's even more further back than that. I would say it's pre-Christian, literally any mythology. It may not have been called the Holy Grail, but womb wisdom, womb knowledge, womb power, all of those words, or concepts, maybe more than words, have been around, even in primordial tribal culture. And so the symbol itself is quite archaic. Now the quest for the Holy Grail first made it into written text in 1180. So we're going to talk about that. That's when the stories started becoming more and more, I guess, fascinating. And an author called Robert de Boron specified its Christian significance around the 1200s, so around the same time, in his poem Joseph de Arimathea, in which he claims that, again, this Holy Grail originated at the Last Supper and at Christ's death. And so there is a lot of mystery that we're going to talk about, that the mystery that was created and then built upon in order to make it appear as though this is something new or something different than the ability of women to naturally create life. Yeah. And so we're going to talk about Arthurian legends as well as the Knights Templar, and perhaps maybe even the recent discovery. There's been a recent discovery of a cup that was dated to around the time of Jesus. So we're just going to look a little bit at what that cup may have been. Yeah. But let's start with the Last Supper. So on the screen, I have an image of the Last Supper by Da Vinci. If you've ever seen the Da Vinci Code, I think that, or heard of the Da Vinci Code, the movie or the book, I think that that sort of sums up popular culture ideology about medieval culture ideology about the Holy Grail. So at the Last Supper, Jesus is said to have drank from a cup and also like held a piece of bread. And in that moment, he says, eat the bread of my body and you will be saved. I'm paraphrasing. And then he takes the cup and says, this is the blood of my blood, drink it and you will be saved. Okay. So these are the two items. And within Catholicism and later on other Christianities, these two items become part of the Eucharist that Christians celebrate at Mass. So when you go to Mass, for example, if you're a Catholic, or in my case, I was raised Greek Orthodox, and then when we came to Canada, I became Roman Catholic. My parents were, one was one and one was the other. In the Greek Orthodox Church, we used to literally have the wafer, which represents the bread, but then we used to also drink from a cup, wine. Okay, so the wine is what Jesus is said to have transformed into his blood. Now, this also for me echoes a bit of Circe and witchcraft, the idea that you can transform wine into blood. And I actually recently participated in a meditation event online that was part of this temple. Oh man, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the temple, but it was like the Temple of the Womb, something like that. And there was this discussion, of course, about menstrual blood and how menstrual blood is sacred and was sacred actually for many ancient tribes and practices. And the leader of this particular meditation and this particular ritual described how even today you can ritualistically transform wine into blood. So one of the things she was saying was, if you are a woman who is past the bleeding age, so you're in menopause or whatever, and so you can't collect your own moon blood, you can transmute a glass of wine into symbolic moon blood. And I thought, wow, that's really fascinating, because that's exactly what Jesus does at this dinner. I mean, he transmutes the bread also into his body, which is already complex enough. And then he transmutes the wine into blood, right? His blood. And so when you go to, some of you who are listening have probably been to Mass. If you're Christian, if you're not, you go to Mass. And then for Greek Orthodox, like I said, you go up there and you take a wafer, and you used to be able to drink from the cup. Literally just take a sip of wine. I remember being a kid and looking forward to the sip of wine. And they used to actually have little crumpets of bread, not the circular wafer that Roman Catholics have. And that was really just the continued ritual of the Eucharist and of this particular Last Supper. And so the cup itself, of course, is, I guess, symbolically the Holy Grail, but obviously not. But it was always like a gold fancy cup, which was always fascinating to me. And then in the Roman Catholic Church, I'm not sure when, probably some of you out there listening know, at some point they no longer share the wine. I think like when you go to Mass now, they hold up the wine, and again, the priest performs a kind of magic trick, right? Like the priest is kind of a wizard or a witch, because the priest changes both the wine that he holds up and the wafers, in theory, into the body and blood of Christ. And then, so there's magic here, no? Like, right? Like, there's magic happening here. There's transmutation happening here. And so Christians do practice magic, interestingly, and witchcraft. But anyways, and so you go up there and you're supposed to eat the wafer. And in the case, like I said, of Catholics, you don't drink the wine, but then you go back to your seat and you reflect on Jesus nourishing and entering your body. Okay. And so this idea of nourishment, we're going to talk about in more detail, because now normally the only human, well, the only human body, let's say, that nourishes another human body is the mother with child, right? So mothers feed their children from their bodies. Literally, when you're pregnant with a child, the child takes literally from you bone density and vitamins and all these kinds of things, right? But then even after the child comes into the world, your body is built to nourish it, to raise it, to take care of it. And so up until, certainly up until the Christian period, the only body that nourished another body is female. But within Christianity, with this ritual that Jesus does at the Last Supper, the nourishment becomes the job of the male. So Jesus, as the male, nourishes his disciples, and in that sense, God through Jesus nourishes his followers, the Christian God. Yeah. So really fascinating stuff. Now, I bring up the Last Supper by Da Vinci because this is what caused a great deal of controversy. And Da Vinci was a conspiracy theorist. I know today that has become a taboo thing to say, because I think a lot of people have taken this word, this conspiracy theorist label, and used it widely and randomly. Yeah, I think I'm not going to go on a rant about that. But Da Vinci himself was someone that was either part of a secret group, or what we would today for sure have called Da Vinci a conspiracy theorist. Now, if you look at this painting of the Last Supper, you can see that there is no cup on the table. Yeah. It is one of the only paintings, and maybe the only painting, but don't quote me, in which there is bread and other little cups around and some food. And Jesus, of course, is in the middle of the table, but there is no cup. Now, for some, this suggests that Da Vinci knew the true history, and that was why Mary Magdalene is included in the painting instead. Now, this over here on the right of Jesus was said by some, okay, that is Mary Magdalene because of the feminine qualities of this individual next to Jesus. Now, some people say this is Joseph, right? His right-hand man. So people have said that this is sort of a more feminine male. I would say that Da Vinci followers and believers see this as Mary Magdalene. Now, as you know, that in the Da Vinci Code and in sort of Da Vinci lore, Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married. And my mentor, Barry Wilson, wrote a book called The Lost Gospel, which is a fantastic book if you want to read it, about a scroll that was found a little while back that confirms or can confirm that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and had children. And so if you believe that, now this is of course heresy for the church, the Catholic Church especially, because Jesus, for some random reason, the Catholic Church believes that Jesus is celibate, despite the fact that Jesus within Jewish culture would not have been celibate, because celibacy was not something that was part of Jewish culture. And in fact, the commandments are to, be fruitful and multiply. And so I think if you think of Jesus as a Jewish man, a Jewish prophet, a Jewish body walking around, in his own time, with all of these followers. Now we know, of course, there's more than 12. The 12 is a Roman Catholic invention, but he had 30, 40 followers that were with him all the time, and he was preaching and he was talking about all these things, and many of them were women or widows. So I think that there is a lot of logic that suggests that Jesus may have been married to Mary Magdalene and that they may have had children. Um, there's no evidence that has been admitted to at this time. And so whenever you have that kind of side evidence or evidence that some people believe, then that becomes all this conspiracy stuff. And so, but to me, as an individual and as an academic and as a Christian, it would not surprise me, as an ex-Christian, it would not surprise me that Jesus would have had a relationship with Mary Magdalene, and it doesn't actually affect my belief in anything he said, right? And so the tradition holds that the Holy Grail is actually the womb of Mary Magdalene, because the womb of Mary Magdalene, if you believe that they were together, would have carried, of course, the bloodline of Christ. And so there are some people who believe that even today there are descendants of the Christ line. Now, I think that's purely logical because Jesus also had brothers and sisters. I know the Catholic Church makes them brothers and sisters in faith, but he had physical, literal brothers and sisters. And so if you think about the Christ family, then, or the Jesus family, then that bloodline, in theory, is still around. Hopefully. There was another documentary that was done. I can't remember what it was called. I'll look it up, guys. Sorry. It was another one that was it the Gospel of James or the Lost Tomb of James? I don't know. It was a while back now, like maybe 8 years ago, where they found a tomb that had boxes, right? Burial boxes. Sorry, words don't come easy to me. Burial boxes that had the names of people that correlated to the Jesus family. So there was a Joseph, there was John, there was a Matthew, there was, I think, everyone except Jesus, obviously. And then there were also ossuaries, not boxes, but ossuaries, which are boxes where people put the bones of their dead. So there was a tomb that had pretty much everyone in the Jesus family, in the immediate family, except of course for Jesus. And they did a bunch of studies on the DNA of the bones to see how they were all related. And they were related like the Jesus family would have been, like his immediate family. And there was this big talk about how this would have been Jesus's family. And there was a child in there, and there were people who thought maybe this is Jesus's child. But we don't have Jesus's DNA. And the names are quite popular at that time. So anyway, there's a pros and cons to this video. But the reason why I bring that up, to this documentary, the reason why I bring that up is because there is a lot of material that suggests that Jesus had this immediate family. Of course, because of his culture, and he was a very religious Jewish man. And one would say he was conservatives. I don't know if I would say Orthodox Jewish, but certainly conservative Jewish. And he was definitely one of what we would call today, one of the Pharisees. And so, or the rabbis or the teachers. And so there's no reason to think that he wouldn't have had the drive, the motivation to follow his own traditions and procreate. And so out of that rationality or reasoning comes this idea that the Holy Grail itself, the blood that gives life and salvation, is the womb of Mary Magdalene, right? And so that's really, really fascinating. There are some other theories that say that the Holy Grail is not actually a bowl, but it symbolizes, and not just Mary Magdalene's womb carrying on this bloodline of Christ, but also represents the boat that Mary took to escape to France. Because we know that after Jesus is crucified and all of his disciples are persecuted, both Marys, the Virgin Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene disappear. Yeah. And so one of the theories is, of course, that Mary Magdalene goes to France. We'll talk about that in a minute with the Knights Templar. And according to legend, the boat that Mary Magdalene escaped in didn't have oars or a mast, right? So this meant that it was an oval shape. There were no men on the boat, according to legend. And an oval shaped boat was always associated with women. And so, again, this is another symbol of this kind of oval chalice bowl kind of type. And then the legend further expands in the belief that Mary Magdalene was associated with the Knights Templar. As we're going to see, the Knights Templar were said to have originated in Jerusalem, and that Mary Magdalene began her association with them while she was still in Jerusalem herself. And then she continued this association with the Knights Templars to Egypt, later on to the English village of Glastonbury. I know I'm saying that wrong. Sorry, my UK friends. And there's even some discussion that Mary Magdalene was trained as one of the Templars. And so again, and that the Templars, as we'll see, protected and were searching for the Holy Grail. And so the fact that Mary Magdalene, who is embodying the Holy Grail in this theory, is then protected by the tradition of the Knights Templar makes sense. Yeah. And so it's not that the Holy Grail is a golden cup or a golden chalice, but it's that Mary Magdalene's womb itself is the golden cup or the golden chalice. And this connects us back. I mean, so again, you don't have to believe this, yeah, this is not church, nor is it some other type of religious conviction. But I think that there is a way to think about these things in a way that makes, at least to me, a little bit of logical sense. And so then the Holy Grail, what's really interesting is then the Holy Grail is not a thing at all. And it is, well, really what we just talked about before, the female body reproducing, in this case, the line of Jesus. There was also another movie with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon that was called Dogma. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a great movie in which they're both angels. And what they're doing is they are also chasing down the modern descendant of Jesus. And part of that is, of course, that she is a child of, or a descendant of children of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And so that was really cool. So this is a long theory. Like I said, Da Vinci was part of the secret kind of cult, underground cult that had access to Vatican records, supposedly, and that knew sort of where this line is. Now, to be fair, if such a line existed, I would have no doubt that in all of the years in which the Vatican chased down relics, information, documents about Jesus and his family and their line, that they would have evidence. I mean, yeah, that also makes sense. So there's a lot, but again, because we don't have these things, we can't really call them facts. So we call them theories or legends or ideas. And then it's up to each individual person to see what makes sense to them and what they believe. But this one is a really cool one. And so I really love the Da Vinci Code. I mean, there are some parts that didn't make sense because the way they aligned the time, I mean, right? Like it is fiction, right? The way they aligned the timeline and they shifted things around. And I was like, I don't know. But that book is fiction that's based on Da Vinci's, and like I said, some of these secret orders and secret groups, and we'll talk about them more. Oh, Knights Templar is next. So I think a lot of that comes out of the many, many secret societies that were built or created during the medieval period, because it was during that time. First of all, two things were happening during that time. The church took control over all education. And so there was a great deal of illiteracy. There's a great deal of ignorance, purposeful ignorance, that is a lack of education, and in fact, a discouragement of education. And so all of the progress that, for example, the Greeks and the Romans and everybody else in the world had made, let's say in the last 5,000 years, and depends on what you believe, maybe even further back, all of that knowledge progress, let's call it that, was then shut down. And so the way I think about it, okay, is kind of like a funnel. I don't know if I've said this before. I apologize if I have. It's kind of like a funnel. Like for me, for example, in the Minoan, Mycenaean, Greek, and even Roman period, right? Because I'm limiting myself to that time frame. The funnel was open, right? Like a wide V. Okay. And then with the dawn of Christianity, especially around 300, starting around 300 CE, when the church canonized the New Testament or the Christian Bible, etc., there began to be a funneling, which I call like the Dark Ages, a funneling, a tight funnel of control and ignorance and lack of knowledge, and in fact, destruction of knowledge. And this is the time of the Knights Templar, and well, actually, this is also the time of Arthurian legend and all of these other things. And then as we move forward through time in this dark tunnel, we get to the 1700s, 1800s, we get to the Enlightenment period. Of course, we get to industrialization. And then to today, the funnel then opens up, like another V opening up, right? And now, let's say in 2022, we are in the wider gap of this opening, okay? The wider gap of this opening. I will argue that we are not yet at the level of knowledge, education, open-mindedness of even the Greeks. In fact, I will argue, and I know some of you will probably argue with me, that we are not even at the level that the Romans had. And we can do a whole podcast on that. How were the ancients living better than us? In so many ways. I mean, the scheduling and the food and the religious freedom and other things, right? Like there's a lot to talk about. Not to say that there weren't issues, of course there always are. Anyways, don't want to get too sidetracked. But so the idea is that we are now back to opening up. And so now, especially actually with the printing press, when the actual Christian Bible became readable in all the languages, and in fact, the Roman Catholic Church believed that this was the way that they would get more followers. But what happened, of course, is when people started to read the text themselves, and I encourage you all, whether you're Christian or not, and you're interested, to read the text for yourself, although it's always good to have an expert with you, but to read the text for yourself. Once people started reading the text for themselves, they started to notice, of course, all of the issues with the text. And that's because really, when you write something down, everything can be questioned. And what actually happened, there was surprisingly for the Catholic Church, what happened is when people began reading the book for themselves, they started breaking apart, right? They started wanting to break apart their own traditions. They interpreted the book differently. And like, that's where we are today. Everybody has their own interpretations or their own churches or their own sort of traditions that broke out of the Catholic Church and other sections. And so all of that, basically, all of what I've just said, basically, is in part why we have so much secrecy and so much sort of exploration and revelation in reading the book and in going back in time and looking at some of these religious secret cults, because we hadn't had the time or the opportunity or the freedom to know what they might have been doing or to analyze what they might have been thinking or any of that information. And so now we have that to some degree. It's still a big secret boys club, but we have some more freedom of information and interpretation than we did before. And that also has pros and cons. I know some of you are probably like, well, that's also not the best thing either, but we are where we are. So let's talk about the Knights Templar. Okay. The Knights Templar, or the Order of the Knights Templar, recognized in 1118, okay, was first created by a French knight called Hughes de Paynes. And Hughes de Paynes formed this order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. That was sort of the original name. And then during the Crusades themselves, several European kingdoms came together under the banner of the Catholic Church so they could conquer Jerusalem, which really, this was a pushback against the Muslim caliphate that was spreading throughout Europe. And the Roman Catholic Church at first thought, oh, well, the the Muslim caliphate, the Muslim religion is not really a threat to us. It's in the East, blah, blah, blah. And then when they hit Spain, especially when they hit Spain, the Roman Catholic Church woke up and thought, holy crap, they're taking us over. And so they created these crusades, these groups of soldiers and armies that were meant to certainly capture Jerusalem from the caliphate. And they did. So in 1099, they captured Jerusalem from the caliphate for a while. And then pilgrims from Europe began making trips to Jerusalem once again. Christian pilgrims is what I'm saying. And while making this journey, many pilgrims were robbed and murdered along the way. And so in order to supposedly protect these pilgrims, Baldwin II, who was the ruler of Jerusalem, encouraged the formation of a new cavalry order. Now, the Knights Templar, this was the Knights Templar, set about their task with a camp on Jerusalem's Temple Mount in 1129. Okay. They got the blessing of the French Catholic Pope at the time, Pope Innocent II. He actually issued a papal bull in 1139 that exempted the Knights Templar for paying any taxes and declaring that they were only answerable to the Pope. So they became a private army, right? This allowed the Templars, or the cult of the army of the Templar, to flourish. And they soon became bankers to the monarchs of Europe and to the pilgrims by creating a system that allowed the pilgrims to deposit assets in their home countries, and then they could withdraw them in Jerusalem. So really fascinating story about the power and the growth of the Knights Templar. In recognition to the amount of money and the wealth that the Knights Templar were collecting, they were also recognized for a strict code of conduct, which included an oath of poverty, obedience, as well as chastity. Okay. So that's really, those three things are really fascinating because they were part of a wealthy cult that, well, today when I think about it, it's very much within that Christian monastery formula, in the sense that, how do I say this? The organization, the institution has the wealth, but the individuals live within this realm of poverty and chastity and obedience. They also wore this highly recognizable signature suit. You can see it in the image here, but you can Google it as well. That was a white robe decorated with a red cross. Now, I know I have some friends that are probably connecting the red cross with the red cross, and there probably is a bunch of stuff like that out there. In fact, the cross itself, we can do a whole, maybe 3 episodes on the cross itself as a symbol, because it's a pre-Christian symbol. And the red cross, even more so, because of course, red represents blood. And here's the Knights Templar looking for the Holy Grail and protecting the Holy Grail. Anyway, so much connections, right, guys? So much. In time, the Knights Templar expanded their influence as new chapters of the orders were formed. So they grew, of course. And at the height of their power, they owned the island of Cyprus. But the Templars were the bankers to all of Europe's nobility. And they also owned a large fleet of ships, not sheep, ships. However, the Muslim Caliphate took back and reconquered Jerusalem in the late 12th century. And that really ended the Christian control in the Holy Land. Okay. Now, what did the Knights Templars do with the loss of Jerusalem? Because they lost Jerusalem, the European nobility started to really question their security, their ability to secure their their goods. And because the European nobility were also heavily indebted to the Knights Templars, they began asking or demanding a destruction of the order. So in 1303, so this is 200 years later, give or take a few years, King Philip IV of France embarked on a campaign to destroy the order of the Knights Templar. Many say it was probably because they refused to give him some more money. And then there was a bunch of mass arrests, torture, false confessions. You know how they do. They were followed by dramatic public burnings at the stake. Okay. False charges of devil worshipping, heresy, and fraud. Okay. So Pope Clement V dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312. In theory, okay, publicly and in theory, okay. Now, some accounts state, or the official accounts, some official accounts state that their property, the property that the Knights Templar had gained for 200 years, was given to another order of knights called the Knights Hospitallers. And it is widely believed that King Philip and King Edward II of England expropriated most of the Knights Templars' wealth for their own benefits. Okay. So there is this, how do I say this? There's this really interesting upward scale where there is a rescue of Jerusalem, search for the Holy Grail, search for Christian relics. These Knights Templars hold these positions of honor. Then they hold positions of power. Then they hold too much power, especially once Jerusalem is lost. What do we do with all these individuals? And then many of them are destroyed, shamed publicly, dishonored, killed, etc. And their wealth is taken from them by other wealthy people. Yeah. Historians do believe that the Knights Templar were most of the Knights Templars were annihilated by King Philip, but groups such as the Freemasons have since emerged, claiming a connection to and a revival of the Knights Templar traditions. So we talked a little bit about the Freemasons in the past, just briefly, based on their use of the Sphinx for their temples and how they're sort of not a secret cult, but a private, cult is the wrong word. Well, depends who you talk to, but a private group. Yeah. Now Freemasonry, of course, was developed, or the Freemasonry was developed 400 years later after the fall of the Knights Templar. So it's difficult to really connect them, but I'm sure many of my friends who are really into this history and the records of this history, and other materials, could probably connect. And of course, the Freemasons themselves have their own records that connect them to their own, to their Knights Templar traditions. Yeah. Now, it is said that in antiquity, the Knights Templar had discovered the Holy Grail, from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper, but it was allegedly kept in a secret vault together with the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. And so there is this theory that some of the knights who are honorable enough, even to today, are guarding the Holy Grail and perhaps the Ark of the Covenant, because the Holy Grail is said to give eternal life. And this is sort of the foundation of modern day legends and modern day stories. And so, again, this idea, right, that an army of men, of trained men, guard this chalice that is said to give life or eternal life or healing or has powers. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, is said to be in or held by the Ethiopian. It's also said to be held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Last I heard, they were the ones claiming to have it, but of course you can't see it. And so there's some fascinating things going on here. There's a lot of mystery around this. Now, of course, the greatest mystery is that, in my opinion, this cup doesn't exist, because it's not a cup. It is literally the body, the reproductive body of women and power of women, shaped into a symbol, an object, a physical object, and then passed down through history as a real thing. But that's my own interpretation. If anyone knows or has seen or has any ideas of where this might be today, that would be fantastic. Please share it in the comments. I'd love to learn more about it. And this brings me to Arthurian legend. So Arthurian legend is a little bit short. I mean, it's not, King Arthur, again, is in a way a problematic character, because there's a lot of mystery around his own existence itself, and the very fact of, did he really exist? Was he a real person? Etc., etc. But there is some interesting medieval legends around the power and the the ongoing search of King Arthur. So there are a few legends around and a few sort of origin stories around how the Holy Grail ends up in the area or is connected to King Arthur. So some Arthurian legends claim that Joseph of Arimathea himself brought the Grail to Glastonbury in England, like we've talked about. One legend says that on the spot where he buried the Grail, so he buried the Grail somewhere, the water runs red because it travels through Christ's blood. And there is a spot in Glastonbury, England, where the water is red, but scientists agree that this is just the effect of the red iron oxide in the soil. Others believe that the Knights Templars themselves brought the Holy Grail and hid it in Glastonbury, England, or in the area of England. Now, the figure of King Arthur was often said to coordinate great spiritual expeditions to search for this relic. Because legend says that this relic has the power to heal all wounds, deliver eternal youth, and grant everlasting happiness. Massive, right? There's one popular Arthurian story, I don't know if you've heard it, of the Fisher King. And the Fisher King is said to have had a serious wound that kept him from moving. And he needed the Grail to be healed and could only sit and fish near his castle until someone found the magical cup. And the magical cup is able to heal his wound. Now, there is a continued search for the Holy Grail, continued even today, years later, after perhaps King Arthur existed or not. People search for this cup itself. And the fascinating part about that is that they imagine it as an actual object, as an actual cup. And there's a great debate of whether it's a stone cup, whether it's a wooden cup, whether it's a gold cup with rubies. So there's a value to it. And people have spent years of their lives rationalizing why a cup would be of stone or of wood or of gold or etc. And years of their life tracing down records that others who have searched for the cup have recorded. So right now we don't know where it is, but and in fact we don't know if it actually existed. So this brings me to our conversations around the womb. Yeah. So the conversations around the womb are really fascinating. I want to talk about just a few things, okay? And how the Grail is actually the life-giving womb of the mother. Now, we talked about how it's the life-giving womb of Mary Magdalene, and I think that's really a hop, skip, and a jump away from the life-giving womb of any mothers and of all mothers. And one of the scholars that I'd like to use, her name is Rosalind Rossignon. She wrote an empirical journal that talks about a particular, what do you call it? A particular story, French story, that's called La Quest del Saint Grail, which is the quest for the Holy Grail. And it's sort of a romantic Knights of the Templar story. And by romantic, I don't mean like a love story, but romantic like the idea that it's embellished in this fantastic fiction. Yeah. Now, so she talks about the representation of the Knights Templar, the representation of the Grail, the representation of everything. But one of the things that I think she talks about that is really important for us and applicable for us is the fact that she talks about how the Holy Grail is doing two things simultaneously. It is in one way absolutely the womb with blood that gives life, and it is in another way purely misogynistic, right? It is in another way purely against women or away from women. And I really thought that was really fascinating. Of course, it in many ways, it represents this idea that both Eve so it goes back to this idea that both the original, let's say, creatress of life, Eve, within Christianity and monotheism, Eve, but also the Virgin Mary, create life from their wombs. But the way that they create life from their wombs is very different, right? So Eve is, of course, always the sinner, the dark, evil mother, the insatiable sexual mother. Well, the Virgin Mary is that pure mother. And it is because of her pure body and her pure self that Jesus, our God, selects her to grow Jesus in her sacred womb and, of course, give birth to Christ. And, I mean, just as a side note, even God could not send his son on this realm without using the organic body of a woman. Just saying, right? I mean, people don't say that. People don't talk about that. But even the divine could not literally make a human without the womb. Yeah. Did I say that loud enough? Okay. My apologies. My apologies for those of you who are listening very closely and my voice is too loud. There is a few concepts about the way that birth is exemplified and healing is exemplified. The idea that transformation is an act of shedding one skin or shedding one part of yourself and growing another. And Jesus is said to have shed his mortal hide, his mortal body, okay, in order to return from death to life. Okay. Now, and he shed his human blood or his human body, human flesh, in order to return from death back to, let's say, eternal life. And the other aspect that we use around the uterus is the shedding of the uterine line, right? When a woman gets her period, that's actually literally what happens. And in fact, if we're talking about transformation, blood is cleansed and rejuvenated every month for women. One can argue that the source of life, blood, is rejuvenated and rebirthed every month. So there's a link between conception, shedding, transformation, and there's also a link between life and death and conception and death. Rosalino gives this really interesting she says, I'll just say what she says. There's a link between conception and death, which constitutes a contamination of the former and of the mother who conceives, who in giving life also gives death. And then likewise this is a story that appears in the Cain and Abel tradition, because Abel was killed by his brother Cain in the very spot where he had been conceived, according to legend. Okay. And so I thought about this because I found this really fascinating that actually in giving life, you're also giving death, because the very act of living leads to death. And so conception and procreation and the giving of life. So when a woman gives life, when a woman gives birth, by the very virtue of being born, you must die. And so in a way, our mothers, your mother, my mother, our mothers, the very existence of our creation and procreation is that we are born to die, right? I mean, none of us get out alive, right? And so there's this birth and rebirth, this can you imagine a patriarchy that is trying to control the entire world, in which the only givers of life and consequently death are women? And so in order to control that very essence of power, you have to give yourself something that gives you equal power. Okay. Now, we've talked about in the past how in Genesis 1 or 2, God creates from his mind. And so this idea that men create with thoughts. Okay. And in fact, I'm sorry that I'm saying this again, but in fact, that really now connects me back to this modern trend of manifestation. The idea that the most powerful way to create something is through your thoughts, and that your thoughts can create. That again is rooted in the masculine inability to create through the body. And so then they create through their minds. And I'm not saying that thoughts are not great and creation and imagination are not fantastic. Of course they are. But the primary, and actually the sole and only way to create life is to have a womb. Yeah? It is the only way to create life known to humans so far. Yeah, I mean, there's probably some cloning going on and other things that people talk about, but that is not technically creation of life. That is a recreation. But anyways, we can talk semantics later. So there is this, the idea of the Holy Grail then being able to give life, to create life, to give a rebirth, then removes the womb, removes women from that power, right? Removes the mother's body of actual physical birth, and like we talked about, maternal nurture. Yeah. And so we've heard about the Virgin Mary often referred to as a holy vessel through which Jesus comes. And so it's really fascinating that Jesus comes through a holy vessel, but then Jesus creates supposedly this cup, this physical thing in which he pours his own blood. And from that moment on, rebirth, salvation, creation, and eternal life is only through the cup and not the very womb that he had to take to get here. Yeah. So, and then we talked a little bit, I don't know if we talked about it too much, but this idea of nurturing, right? This idea that the female body, the mother's body, feeds you. And in Christianity, what happens is this gets removed from women. This task gets removed from women. And now Jesus, spiritually speaking, not physically, but I mean, technically you're still eating bread and drinking wine. So I guess it is a kind of physical act. But in this removal, women are removed completely from the ability to create and salvation and rebirth and all those power that they had, because now you have this ritual of the Eucharist in which Jesus is nourishing you, or God is nourishing you. Okay. And I mean, you think about it and you're thinking, yeah, this is spiritual nourishment, but there is this really fascinating idea that Jesus says, this is my body. And the only body that nourishes us is women's body. Our mother's bodies are the only bodies. And so I wonder, I made this connection, and you tell me what you think. Okay. Because this maternal feature becomes a paternal feature. And so I thought to myself, if feeding is the source of life, first from the mother, is that why we had this push for so many generations of men becoming the providers, of men becoming those that feed and provide us, right? Because men are, in the old days, supposed to go to work and provide for the family. What did they provide? Money to buy food, nourishment, or often men on farms, for example, would provide food. Now, of course, women were on farms too, and women are now going to work. So that's a different thing. But just this idea of men as providers, right? I wonder if that in a way, again, takes away from the fact that the very first provider body that we all have is our mother. And then as we grow, our father becomes the provider, the mother is removed. And if you're a young man, you are expected then to remove yourself from your mother, as Freud goes on with his Oedipal complex, to remove yourself from your mother and then become the provider of your own family, right? By doing something external. In fact, okay, that's just, sorry. In fact, as a man, you have to leave your family, go out there and bring back food. Does that make sense? While the mother has food within her body, within her household, within her home. Right? Fascinating stuff when you think about the way that the Grail represents life-giving, life feeding from God's body, right? Then becomes the primary source of salvation, not feeding from the mother's body, right? So really, really, really fascinating, right? And also this idea that the blood in the cup comes from two things. Number one, Jesus transmutes the wine into his own blood. And then supposedly Joseph of Arimathea gets some blood from the wound that is in the cup. And so that in his dying sort of sacrifice, the blood goes in the cup, and that's what gives the cup its healing power. And so again, the idea is that Jesus, like, I'm sorry. Jesus bleeds from a wound, and that blood gives life, as opposed to women bleeding every month, and that blood gives life. Does that make sense? So here we have a ritual vehicle, or a ritual, where the figure of the symbolic father or male appropriates yet another maternal function, that of giving life, of incarnation into flesh, right? Of giving salvation, right? And in fact, of even giving death. And so I find it just fascinating that the wound of Jesus, the blood that comes from the wound of Jesus, can feed men and women, but feed men primarily. So the blood of men feeds men, like the Templars and all the other men, feeds men and saves them and gives them eternal life. But the blood of women that has been giving life since the beginning of time is seen as a reproductive task. So you can see why the Holy Grail, I think, has been, in a sense, almost taken back, or starting to be taken back. And also you can probably see why I really wanted to do this. I wanted to do this episode because this idea, right, this ritual around the incarnation of Jesus in the flesh from an object that represents Mary's womb, and then is taken, like I said, outside the body and becomes an object or a figure that is material culture, whether it's wood or stone or gold, is really a primary symbol, has primary and archaic and primordial meaning. Okay. So then the symbol becomes disassociated from the mother. The symbol of life and life-giving becomes disassociated from the mother. And the Grail metaphorically facilitates a vision of rebirth without the mother, eliminating her, replacing her with a paternal masculine God who takes over the primary function of providing nourishment and giving life, but remains uncontaminated by a mother's sexuality and morality. Okay, that's a quote from Rossellini. The idea then is that the patriarchy has found a way to create birth, nourishment, and salvation without sex, without morality. The cup has no morality. Without women being involved, without discussing goddess power, female power, mother power, and without discussing womb power and womb wisdom. So I hope that you're as fascinated and mind blown as I am, because it never fails. Yeah. It never fails to surprise me at how patriarchy has reassigned life-giving and nurturing and reproductive power from a mother, or a mother god, or a goddess, or an earth mother, or organic mother, to a godfather that is, somewhere in the sky. Yeah. And so this is how men, that leading patriarchal sort of authorities, have given themselves the ultimate power. So every time you see that cup, whether you go to church or whether you're watching it on TV or anything, and you see that priest hold up the cup, I want you to remember your mother, because that is really the symbol that they are holding up. That is truly the symbol that is life-giving, that is salvation, that is rebirth, and that is nurturing. Because while you're in the uterus, while you're in the cup, you are being nurtured, you are protected, you are being fed. And as we've talked about before, when we talked about the cave and the womb, while you're in this cup, actually, something happens that the supposed Holy Grail object cannot do. While you're in the womb, while we are all in the womb, because we all come from a womb, we are in cosmic presence. That is, we are not yet on the outside, a fully formed individual human body, and we are not still in the spiritual realm. We are in the cosmic medium space. And that is something that actually even the cup of this Holy Grail cannot reproduce. Because it's a physical thing that you supposedly drink from. There is no cosmic connection. Although supposedly drinking the blood gives you salvation. But the cosmic connection happens in the womb. And the true nurturing happens in the womb. And so I suppose the end of my argument is that the Holy Grail is the womb. Whether it's the womb of Mary Magdalene, whether it's the womb or the holy vessel of the Virgin Mary, whether it's the womb of all women that have ever lived on all of time, whether they procreated or not, all female biological bodies have this power incarnate in them. And I think it is lately and recently that more and more women are turning to that power, and more men are understanding that that power is not antagonistic of them, right? That because I think we're so used to patriarchal power, and so patriarchal power is control, oppression, authority. Divine feminine power, or womb power, or whatever you want to call it, goddess power, maternal, matriarchal power is not like that. In fact, I want to say it's the opposite. It's a power that comes from all of us and within all of us and grows out of us. Right. So it's a bottom up power instead of a top down power. And so I'm really happy to see that more and more men understand that this is not an antagonism. And yes, there are a lot of women that are angry. There's a lot of rage going on because, female bodies are still being controlled. Why do you think Roe versus Wade was repealed? I mean, the fact that we still have to control female bodies in North America and procreation and recreation and all these kinds of things tells you that they are a threat, right? And that they are objects of power, right? But I understand that there's a lot of rage over the fact that we are being controlled continually. And at some point, something will have to be done, ladies and gentlemen. At some point, we will have to come together and say, no body belongs to the state. No literal, physical, organic body belongs to the state, But hopefully we're getting there soon enough. So I want to reiterate that this work towards the divine feminine and this use of the divine feminine is not anti-male, but it is anti-patriarchy. Absolutely 100%. And so, but patriarchy to me doesn't necessarily define men. It is a system of power in which men hold power, certainly those in authority. But it's not men. I don't know how to explain that, but you know what I'm saying, right? And so we're in this tough time right now. We're in this tough time right now because there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of fall back into old traditions, move forwards. There's a lot of things going on. But to leave you on an optimistic note, I want you to know that the very fact that the system is shaking, that things are shifting, that there are discussions, debate, even heated, even hard. I wish it could be a bit gentler, but change is not always gentle. Yeah. And so I think that we are moving towards positive change, but that it hurts as always in doing so. So Thank you so much for joining me in this episode today for the Goddess Project podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoy talking about it. And please leave me comments with your thoughts, suggestions, anything. Again, I'm open to all of your feedback, to your opinions, to your sources, if you have any. I do enjoy a discussion about different topics or even different ideas that you might have. Please leave them in the comments as gently and respectfully as you can. Most of the people that have everyone that has commented on my videos, I just want to say thank you. You've been amazing. Again, we don't have to agree on everything or really anything. I do think we have to learn to have discussions, which I'm hoping that we are. And so thank you so much for joining me. So I'm going to post after the podcast. As you can see, we're going to talk about the Grail in Hollywood. I have so much to say about the Grail in Hollywood. But that recording will happen in a minute and after, and I post that on the Patreon. You can watch it on Patreon or you can listen to it on Patreon if you are one of the Patreon supporters. You can find my Patreon link just at the top. What is that? Right-hand corner on my YouTube page or in my link trees on Instagrams or Twitter or everywhere if you'd like to support this podcast. And I would really appreciate it if you did. So other than that, thank you so much for joining me. Next week, we're going to look at sirens and mermaids. We're going to have a blast. I'm going to look at how sirens were originally half bird, half female, and when they became associated with mermaids, which are half fish, half women. So we're gonna look at some of that stuff and talk a little bit, maybe even about fairy tales and Disney and all that fun stuff. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you have a fantastic day. Again, hit me up on social media or anywhere else that you might find me, and have the best Friday, have the best weekend. I'll see you all next week.